in Africa, where we discuss pertinent issues of peace and development across Africa and around the world. And today we'll be talking about a very important topic, which is definitely new in itself, because it's the need for a new paradigm. And which is this paradigm? I'm sure this is the question that all of us, excuse me, are asking. And the speaker today is Helga Zeep LaRouche, and she's from Germany. She received her education as a journalist in Hanover and Hamburg, and studied political science, history, and philosophy at the Free University Berlin and in Frankfurt am Main. And she's married since 1977 to the American economist Lyndon LaRouche. She's the founder in 1984 of the International Schiller Institute, an extensive programmatic studies for a just new world economic order. She and her husband authored in 1991 the program for a Eurasian land bridge. Author of the New Silk Road becomes the World Land Bridge, and authored also The Lost Chance of 1989, plus hundreds of articles on Friedrich Schiller, Nicholas of Cusa, European classical poetry, dialogue and civilization, economics, strategic analysis, and history. Actually, I used to think that we organize many academic conferences and seminars here in Global Peace, but she does more than that. So it's really a pleasure having you, Helga. The pleasure is ours. You are welcome to speak to us, and after your presentation, we'll have questions and comments from the participants. So now I'd like to ask the rest of us to please mute our microphones and then give her the floor. Thank you very much, Helga. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much for your introduction, and I welcome you wherever you may be. Before I go into the substance of what I want to talk about, namely the new paradigm, which I think is urgently needed, I have to start with recognition of the fact that many, many people around the world are extremely worried because the danger of a global nuclear war is on the mind of everybody who follows the strategic situation. And, you know, this war danger comes from the fact that there are two different systems which are clashing right now. And what is the difference of these two different systems, I will talk about shortly. Now, on May 3rd, two drones hit the buildings of the Kremlin in Moscow. They did not detonate because the Russian defense system disabled them, but you know, it was a serious impact nevertheless. Now, immediately the Western media and many politicians in the West said, oh, you know, this was just a fake. First, they said it's a fake thing, it didn't happen. Then they said that the Russians did it themselves. And then it basically disappeared from the news. But very differently, Russia basically said this was an assassination attempt on the Russian president, and they will take countermeasures, which they will not announce what they will be, but they will be felt. Now, the Swiss Colonel Bossart, who is an expert on nuclear weapons and other weapon systems, immediately said that this was a probe by the Ukrainians trying to make a decapitation strike against the Russian leadership. Now, the United States naturally totally rejected that they were involved, but the Russian government accused Washington of being behind this move. Now, that means we were one gigantic step closer to nuclear war. And it has been in the recent months that the Journal of the Atomic Scientists moved the doomsday clock, the danger of nuclear war, to 90 seconds from midnight. And anybody who has studied what would happen if it ever comes to nuclear war knows that, if only one nuclear weapon is used, the likelihood that the entire arsenal of all sides will come into effect is almost certain, and that the likelihood that something like a limited nuclear war is possible is really going towards zero. If this would happen, and scientists like Stephen Starr or Ted Postol or Hans Christiansen have made very clear that any such exchange would be followed by a nuclear winter of about 10 years, in which all life on the planet would basically vanish because nothing would grow anymore. So we are looking at the potential annihilation of the human species. Now, I cannot go into all the reasons how we got there, but one has to take it back at least 52 years back to 1971, when President Nixon took the dollar of the gold standard and replaced fixed exchange rates with floating ones, where my late husband at that time made a prophetic prognosis. And he said, if the West remains on that road of liberal economics, replacing investment in physical economy, in profit maximization, in deregulation of the markets, in making money for money's sake, then that would lead necessarily to a new depression, a new danger of fascism, and the danger of a new world war. Now, that was in 71. And 52 years later, I have to say that we are exactly at that point. Now, my husband not only spent his time to warn against the endemic mistakes of the neoliberal system, which really went into full swing after what Nixon had done, but he also offered alternatives. So in 1975, after he visited Iraq and had met there with many leaders of the non-aligned movement, he came back and he proposed to replace the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank with an international development bank, which was supposed to give long-term cheap credit, maybe 1% interest rate over 20, 30, 40, 50 years for investments in development projects in the global south, about 400 billion per year. And, if that would have been implemented, the developing countries would be in a very different situation than they are now. Now, we took that proposal, the International Development Bank proposal, and organized for one full year among the non-aligned movement. And in 1976, at the annual conference of the non-aligned movement in Colombo, Sri Lanka, they adopted a plan for a new world economic order, which was more or less identical with the IDB proposal. Now, at that time, the effort by what clearly was 3/4 of the human species or more to have a just new world economic order did not succeed, because there was a destabilization against the key leaders, against Mrs. Bandaranaike from Sri Lanka, against Indira Gandhi from India. Ali Bhutto was even assassinated. So that effort did not succeed. Now, we at that time, can you please put in the photo, the picture of 76? Oh, we don't have that. Okay. So at that point, basically, we already had a plan for the development of Africa, which I don't have the picture here now. So in 1984, my husband made another prophetic prediction, and that was that if the Soviet Union would continue on the policy which they had at that time, would continue. They would collapse in 5 years. Now, I jump over a lot of years here now, but so we were not completely surprised when the Comic-Con had many problems. And in '88, my husband had actually proposed in Berlin that the German unification could take place soon, and Berlin would be the capital. At that point, nobody believed that. But as you know, we know history proved in '89, the wall came down, and we had already worked on economic development programs so that we could already in January 1990, after the wall had come down, we proposed the integration of Eurasia, the industrial and population centers of Europe with those of Asia, and we called it the Eurasian Land Bridge. This was our idea for a peace program for the 21st century, and it could have become the motor for such a new world economic order. I just want to remind people that in '91, when the Soviet Union disintegrated, Pope John Paul II had warned. He said, the fact that the Soviet Union and the communist system has collapsed should not lead people to the assumption that they are a morally superior system. The West should not think that they are superior. Look at the condition of the developing countries, and you will see that we are dealing with empires of evil and empires of sin. Now, at that time, if you also remember, already in 1990, the US Secretary of State, Baker III, had promised to Gorbachev that if the Soviet Union would agree to the peaceful reunification of Germany, that NATO would not move 1 inch to the east. The problem was that at that time, the neocons in the United States, basically the conservatives, Richard Perle, Cheney, Wolfowitz, and others, they developed the PNAC, the Project for a New American Century, which then became the Wolfowitz Doctrine, which basically said, now that the United States is the only superpower left, we will make sure that no country or no bloc of countries will ever become bigger in terms of economics, socially, or militarily. Now, that Wolfowitz Doctrine is the present US doctrine, and that is what is behind the effort by the United States to keep an unipolar world practically to the present day. Now, contrary to the promise, there were 6 NATO expansions to the east. The border of NATO moved about 1,000 kilometers to the east, up to the border of Russia, and the most recent expansion, including Finland, increased that border by 1,300 kilometers, where basically NATO and the Russian border are one. Now, again, I'm jumping over many steps. In 2014, you had the Maidan coup, which was entirely sponsored by the United States. Victoria Nuland bragged, that she spent, or the State Department spent, $5 billion on NGOs and other things in Ukraine alone. And, the West never denounced what actually happened in the Maidan coup. There was an effort to have the Minsk process, about which Chancellor Merkel and former President of France, Hollande, in the meantime admitted that they only participated in the Minsk process to gain time to arm the Ukrainian armed forces in an obvious effort or an obvious anticipation that it would come to an inevitable war with Russia. There was no effort to enforce the Minsk agreement. And, all the time Russia complained that there were Ukrainian army attacks on the Donbass. There was even an OSCE report stating the many attacks, but there was no reaction to that. And then in Zelensky at the Munich Security Conference started to demand nuclear weapons for Ukraine. all of this led to a situation where Putin, in December 2021, demanded from the United States and NATO legally binding security guarantees that Ukraine would not become a member of NATO and there would be no offensive weapons established at the border of Russia. And that request was basically, ignored. The US and NATO only answered on secondary issues like, you will resume arms negotiations, but they did not address the concerns. And in the meantime, the Russian government has stated many times that they felt threatened in their existence, and that's why they started what they call the special military operation. Now, the American Secretary of Defense, Austin, has said many times that the aim of the Ukraine war is to weaken Russia. German Foreign Minister Baerbock has said many times that they want to ruin Russia, even, that she at one point declared that we are already at war with Russia, that had to be basically taken back. But the Post-Russia Forum, which is an organization which is sponsored by the Jamestown Foundation in the United States and the Hudson Institute, they just had a series of conferences last week in Washington, in Philadelphia, where they discussed how to strengthen partisan attack inside Russia with the aim to split Russia into 10 or 12 different states. Now, anybody who has watched the military parade of Russia yesterday and saw the ICBM nuclear missiles should really be extremely worried about the idea that Russia is being split into 10 or 12 places, because what would happen with these nuclear weapons under these conditions should be the concern of everybody. It is also clear that in all of that, there were attempts to end the war, to come to the negotiation table. Pope Francis has offered the venue of the Vatican to have such negotiations. Last March of last year, President Zelensky was ready to enter such negotiations. And then, Boris Johnson went to Kiev and said, no, now is not the time. And that was repeated again by Sir Richard Dearlove, the former head of MI6, who just last week went to Kiev and again said, no negotiations, this is not the time to have peace. Now, the situation is at a deadlock because the war hawks on the Western side say Ukraine must win, Russia must be defeated. On the other side, Russia is a nuclear power, and in one sense, they are the strongest nuclear power, and they cannot lose. So that is why the danger of nuclear war is so absolutely high. The United States itself, they are divided. You have the military leaning more in the direction of negotiations. The head of the Joint Chief of Staff, General Milley, already last year, more than a year ago, came out and said, now is the time to negotiate. Kissinger, basically said it's time to think about ending the war. But then you have on the other side, the State Department and the National Security Council, who are for more weapons to Ukraine. And, so the spiral continues. Now, in the meantime, naturally, the sanctions against Russia have been put at an all-time high, and the dollar was weaponized. The United States and Western banks seized 300 billion assets, dollar worth of assets of Russia. They seized 9 billion of Afghanistan and numerous other accounts of other countries. And all of that has led to a situation where now many countries of the global south are what is called de-dollarizing, looking for an alternative currency. Now, a new element has to be looked at, and that is that since 2013, President Xi Jinping of China introduced the new Silk Road. He did that in a speech in Kazakhstan, and basically the Belt and Road Initiative in the 14 years since, or no, in the 10 years since, has become the largest infrastructure project in the history of the United States, transforming many countries, many investment projects in Africa and Latin America, high-speed railway from Bandung to Jakarta, another high-speed railway from Myanmar to Kunming in China, the CPEC, China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, and many, many other projects. And if you compare the new Silk Road and Belt and Road Initiative as it is now being implemented with the initial plans of our Eurasian land bridge from 1991, which we in the meantime had elaborated in a big report, which is called The New Silk Road Becomes the World Land Bridge, which is a plan to industrialize and infrastructurally develop all 5 continents and develop them through corridors and tunnels and bridges to basically have a world economic development plan. Well, you will see that the Chinese plan and what we have produced over the last decades is very, very similar and in some parts absolutely identical. Now that Chinese sponsored new model, and China has made the biggest economic miracle in the history of mankind also. They transformed their own economy. They lifted 850 million people out of poverty into, many of them, 400 million are already a well-to-do middle class. And by making their development plan available to countries of the global south, they have completely changed the dynamic in the world and given the non-aligned movement for the first time the ability to overcome poverty and underdevelopment. Now, so you have now 2 systems. You have the West, basically, insisting that there must be the rules-based order, the values of the West must be listened to. But the problem is their financial system, the system of the United States and Europe and Great Britain, is on the edge of bankruptcy. Bloomberg just published a couple of days ago a report that in the United States, 2,300 of 4,800 American banks are basically exposed with liabilities which are higher than their assets. So de facto, they are actually bankrupt. And the bankruptcy of the new Silicon Valley Bank in California and the First Republic Bank are only the tip of the iceberg. You had the Credit Suisse Bank in Switzerland going bankrupt, being taken over by the Union Bank of Switzerland, now creating a mega monster bank for Switzerland, which is a huge vulnerability. So you have 2 blocks. You have the Western bloc, which insists that their system should be the only one, which defines the rules. They call themselves the democracies, who are supposedly in a fight against the, quote, autocracies, dictatorships. And, the tendency is, and the fight between these 2 systems where, the global south, encouraged through the economic power of China, is basically attempting to create a new system which overcomes colonialism in its modern form forever. Now, President Sukarno in 1955 at the Bandung Conference already had warned that while colonialism formally is overcome and you have independence, de facto it continued to exist in the form of banking rules, access to credit, trade rules. And, that is what is now being challenged. And the biggest problem, the war danger, comes from the fact the Ukraine, in one sense, is only the more or less accidental trigger point, but the more fundamental reason why there is a danger of the US, NATO, the EU, Great Britain on the one side, and Russia, China on the other side, is because underlying is the fight between these 2 systems. Now, the roots of the neoliberal system I want to take a look at, because many people think the British Empire no longer exists. But if you really look at it, it does continue to exist. And it exists, among others, in the form of an ideology, which is British liberalism. Now, the fundamental reason why the liberal paradigm and the underlying current transatlantic rules-based order have failed, and why the establishment of that system is proving to be so completely unable to reflect on the reasons for this failure, is linked to the axiomatic basis and the generally accepted assumptions of this paradigm's image of man, as well as the concept of state and science. Now, you have to take this back about 600 years. After the initial emergence of the Italian Renaissance, and with that, for the first time, the form of a state which consciously fostered the creative capacity of a growing proportion of the population and the role of scientific progress as the source of social wealth. At that time, you had an increase of the urbanization. You had more and more people becoming literate, especially after Gutenberg's discoveries of printing. And you had a tendency that for the first time, you had forms of government where the common good was the purpose, like in the France of Louis XI, where the living standard of the population doubled in the 20 years of his reign. Now, that was the first time that you had a sovereign nation state devoted to the common good of the people, because up to that point, all forms of government, at least in Europe, were for the advantage of an oligarchy, a feudal oligarchy, where only the privileges of the ruling class was of interest. But when this nation state emerged, the then existing oligarchical system, Venice, regarded that system as a crucial threat to its existence. And they launched a counteroffensive of which Paolo Sarpi was the leading thinker. Now, Paolo Sarpi can be regarded as the author of which all Enlightenment and liberalism ultimately developed. His idea was that, one had to control the scientific debate. One had to deny the ability to know and discover real universal principles to the population. Only a small class of, priests and oligarchs could have access to knowledge. So one had to suppress the Promethean potential and, if need be, also, reduce the people to the idea of sensuous experience, and basically, not have scientific ideas which could be learned, but to turn the backwardness of human nature into a dogma. So from this tradition came the mechanistic scientific tradition of Galileo Galilei, of Isaac Newton, and out of this developed later the game theory and information theory of John von Neumann and Norbert Wiener, and more recently, all the mathematical models which control the internet, the artificial intelligence, algorithms, and various such things. They're also used in the derivative trading of today's casino economy. And it is a form of pseudoscience which does not correspond to the actual physical laws of the universe. Now, the empirical and materialistical dogma and decadent image of man, which was peddled by philosophers or ideologues such as Thomas Hobbes, Thomas Malthus, Jeremy Bentham, John Locke, and John Stuart Mill, remain to the day the basis of British liberalism, and this virus has contributed more to the current state of the world than anything else. The oligarchical mindset of the British Empire, which denies all men, but especially all colored men, the divine spark of creativity is expressed in full clarity in the numerous writings and statements. And if people only care to look for them, from Prince Philip's notorious wish to be reincarnated as a deadly virus in order to help to reduce the overpopulation of the human race, to the despicable outlook expressed by Adam Smith in his theory of moral sentiments of 1759, and I read you a quote: "The administration of the great system of the universe, the care of universal happiness of rational and sensible beings is the business of God and not of man. To man is allotted a much humbler department, but one much more suited, able to the weakness of his powers and to the narrowness of comprehension. They are of his own happiness, that of his family, his friends, his country. Nature has directed us to the greater part of these original and immediate instincts: hunger, thirst, the passion which unites the sexes, the love of pleasure, and the dread of pain, prompt us to apply those means for their own sake and without any consideration of their tendency to those beneficent ends which the great director of nature intended to produce by them." Now, this quote, basically says, the large issues are those of God, and, people should not be concerned with these big issues, just little issues. Keep people in their place. Since these attributes are all apply equally to animals, then it is obviously also okay to cull the herd periodically, just as the Romans killed the slaves, the Spartans killed the helots when they thought that they would become too numerous. In other words, the right to kill people when they get too many, to depopulate them, is completely fitting this world outlook. This misanthropic image of man is amplified through pure racism, as Bertrand Russell expressed it so unashamedly in his writings, The Prospect of Industrial Civilization. And I read you the quote now. "The white population of the world will soon cease to increase. The Asiatic races will be longer, and the Negroes still longer, before their birth rate falls sufficiently to make their numbers stable without the help of war and pestilence. Until that happens, the benefits aimed by socialism can only partially be realized, and the less prolific races will have to defend themselves against the more prolific races by methods which are disgusting, even if they are necessary." So again, here you have the idea that it is okay to reduce the population. It is precisely this racist ideology which was the justification for colonialism, the slave trade, the opium wars, and to be honest, it is ultimately also the reason for the monumental indifference shown by large parts of the population in the West when they hear the news about the locust plague in Africa and in some Asian countries, which could have been eliminated all by 75 million. And nothing has changed in the fundamental support for eugenics among the representatives of the empire. That was again emphasized in a column in the Daily Telegraph, March 3rd, 2020, by Jeremy Warner, and I'm reading you the quote now. "Not to put a fine point on it, from an entirely disinterested economic perspective, the COVID-19 might even prove mildly beneficial in the long term by disproportionately culling elderly dependents." So now I want to show you a clip of an event which recently happened and which you all have may have seen already. Just give me one moment. Well, you all have probably seen it, so I want to spare you the longer ceremony. Well, anyway, I just wanted to touch on the reality of the continued existence of the British Empire. And now I want to come to what I think is necessary. I think that in order to overcome the pending clash and potential, descent into World War III, we absolutely have to take a totally different approach. We have to have a new global security and development architecture which overcomes these two blocks, because as long as these two blocks continue to exist, the war danger will tend to escalate. And that means we have to take a model on the Peace of Westphalia, which ended 150 years of religious warfare, of which the 30 Years' War was just the final phase. And that was basically due to the recognition of the different war participants that they realized if they would continue the war, nobody would survive it, because at that point, 1/3 of the population, 1/3 of the villages, 1/3 of the animals were already destroyed. So they were sitting down and negotiated for 4 years the principles of the Peace of Westphalia, of which the most important one was that any peace agreement has to take into account the interest of the other. And in this case, the interest of all others. So the new security architecture which we need must take into account the security interest of Russia, China, the United States, Africa, Europe, Latin America, Asia, and all countries. Now, I have campaigned for this idea now for almost 3/4 of a year, or more than half a year. And the idea to have such a new security and development architecture is being discussed among many circles in universities, in international institutions. And I think we have to have an urgent discussion in that also in Africa. And therefore, I want to read to you 10 principles, because people ask, so what do you mean? How should such a new security and development architecture look like? What are the ideas on which it should be based? And I wrote 10 principles, and I want to read them to you so that you can discuss what you think about it and if you agree with them or not. Now, basically, these ideas naturally are not the last word. They are meant to be food for thought and the starting point of a dialogue among all concerned people to find a durable peace order. The first principle is the new international security and development architecture must be a partnership of perfectly sovereign nation states based on the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence and the UN Charter. Second, the absolute priority must be to alleviate poverty in every nation on the planet, which is easily possible if existing technologies are used for the benefit of the common good. Third, the life expectancy of all people must be prolonged to its fullest potential by creating modern health systems in every country on the planet. This is also the only way by which the present and future potential pandemics can be overcome or be prevented. Fourth, since mankind is the only creative species known so far in the universe, and given the fact that human creativity is the only source of wealth through the potentially limitless discovery of new universal principles, one of the main aims of the new international security and development architecture must be providing access to universal education for every child and adult person living. The true nature of man is to become a beautiful soul, as Schiller discusses this, and the only kind of person who can fulfill that condition is the genius, according to Schiller. Fifth, the international financial system must be reorganized so that it can provide productive credit to accomplish these aims. Reference points can be the original Bretton Woods system as President Franklin D. Roosevelt intended it. Also, Roosevelt's intention was never fully implemented due to his untimely death, and the 4 laws proposed by LaRouche. The primary aim of such a new credit system must be to increase dramatically living standards, especially in the nations of the global South and the poor in the global North. 6, the new economic order must focus on creating the conditions for modern industries and agriculture, starting with the infrastructural development of all continents to be eventually connected by tunnels and bridges to become a world land bridge. 7th, the new global security architecture must eliminate the concept of geopolitics by ending the division of the world into blocks. The security concerns of every sovereign nation must be taken into account. Nuclear weapons and other weapons of mass destruction must immediately be banned. Through international cooperation, the means must be developed to make nuclear weapons technologically obsolete, as it was originally intended by the proposal which became known as the Strategic Defense Initiative, suggested by LaRouche and made as an offer to the Soviet Union by President Reagan. 8th, in former times, one civilization at one corner of the world could go under, and the rest of the world would only find out years later due to the length of distances and the time needed for travel. Now, for the first time, because of nuclear weapons, pandemics, the internet, and other global effects, mankind is sitting in one boat. Therefore, a solution to the existential threat of humanity cannot be found with the help of secondary or partial arrangements. Rather, the solution can only be found on the level of that higher one, which is more powerful than the many. It requires the thinking on the level of the coincidentia oppositorum, the coincidence of opposites, of Nicolaus of Cusa. 9th, in order to overcome the conflicts arising out of the quarreling opinions which is how empires have maintained control over their underlings, the economic, social, and political order has to be brought into cohesion with the lawfulness of the physical universe. In European philosophy, this was discussed as the being in character with natural law. In Indian philosophy as cosmology, and in other cultures, appropriate notions can be found. Modern sciences such as space science, biophysics, and thermonuclear fusion science will continuously increase the knowledge of mankind about this lawfulness. A similar cohesion can be found in the great works of classical art in different cultures. Hence, the basic assumption for the new paradigm is that man is fundamentally good, capable of infinitely perfecting the creativity of his mind and the beauty of his soul, and the most advanced geological force in the universe, which proves that the lawfulness of the mind and that of the physical universe are in correspondence and cohesion, and that all evil is the result of a lack of development and therefore can be overcome. So that is what I suggest should be the subject of discussion, how to create such a new security and development architecture. And I think it is eminently possible because a new world economic order is emerging. The vast majority of the countries of the global south are engaged in such a dialogue already. They are creating a new currency, a new bank is being created, the new development bank, which was just announced by President Lula in Shanghai. And Dilma Rousseff was made the new director of it. The new development bank has many features which are, you know, in the tradition of the IDB, the International Development Bank, proposed by my husband in 1975. So the big task will be to convince the people in the European nations and the United States that they should not fight this effort, but instead join hands with the developing countries to cooperate, to shape the next epoch of development of the human species, and to together create a renaissance of the highest traditions of all cultures, and out of that create something new. So this is why the Schiller Institute is involved in an effort to create an international movement of world citizens who work together to shape the next phase of the evolution of mankind and to consciously initiate a new epoch of human civilization. And I invite you to be part of that. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Helga, for this wonderful presentation. A lot of useful information. And now I would like to invite participants for comments or questions. You may, of course, put them in chat, but also speak them out aloud so we can all hear, and of course Helga will be happy to respond to you. And so the theme, as you know, the need for a new paradigm, and that's what she has explained. And this is a global peace studies for sustainable development in Africa. So you're welcome for questions or comments. Yes, I can see Howard. Please unmute Howard Richards. Unmute your microphone.
Oh, okay, I unmuted. Okay.
Great, lovely. Nice to see
okay.
you, Howard.
Nice to see you. I want to congratulate Helga for telling so much truth that it's so hard to tell these days. Also, I agree with Lukong's 10 principles also. But what I think is happening is that we're rediscovering what people already discovered at the end of World War II. At that time, filled with idealism, when the United Nations was founded and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was made out, people understood that peace requires justice. As the Bishop of Seville, Cardinal Amigo, said, peace is a table with 4 legs, and the 4 legs are justice, 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 and justice. And that was pretty well understood at that time, and things were supposed to be better. World War II was such a total disaster. Their atomic weapons were dropped on Japan, and people said, well, this can't happen again. And in order for it not to happen again, we have to live a different way. I think Evelyn Lindner, in her recent paper commenting on the current world situation, summed things up quite briefly, but accurately, when she said too many things are done from the profit motive and not enough things are done from a care ethic. So I think that's a sort of a summary or umbrella idea that can include many others. So I think I agree with the principles, but I want to ask the question. Well, I want to advertise my own work a little bit and my co-authors in this respect. That, my co-author Joanna Swanger and I did in our book called Dilemmas, called Social Democracies, as we said, well, why did it not work? Why did all these wonderful ideas that were going to be development and there are going to be human rights and all these things were going to happen, and they didn't happen? What happened was that we got this complete chaos we have today. Threat of nuclear war. We all know the polluted city. So I don't know. Well, I think the simple answer is encapsulated in Evelyn's phrase that too much is done from the profit motive. Where the idea is, well, we're going to have development, but we're only going to have development if it's profitable. In fact, development turned into another name for investment. And I have a lot of friends in Bolivia where they're really making progress on a lot of things. And the Minister of Economics of Bolivia once said that, well, what is called development theory is really investment theory. It's really how to attract investors. And that's the problem. We have to work on a basic ethical transformation. And the sort of good news is we can start with ourselves. We can say, well, in our lives, what are we doing from a care ethic? What are we doing to make it possible to do the sorts of things that Helga and Lukang and the Eleanor Roosevelt and all of the people who have already basically figured out what has to happen. Why is it not happening? Well, I think to bore everybody with the same message, we need to remember the wisdom of the ages, which somehow we have managed to forget. I'm a little muddled speaking extempore, but I trust other people will fill in the gaps and make corrections.
Yeah, thank you very much, Howard. Maybe Helga, you would like to say something about that, to maybe respond or comment on Howard Richard's comment.
But I think we have reason to be a little bit more optimistic because, the problem was that, the British system, which, you can differentiate between the American system and the British system or the English system. The American Revolution was made against the British Empire, and Alexander Hamilton developed a different system of investment for the common good. Now, when you look at the Chinese success today, you can actually prove that what the Chinese economic model is doing right now is very much like the beginning period of the American Revolution, where investments are not done for individual profit, but are done for the furthering of the common good, and the role of the state has a much larger part in that. The problem was that in the post-war period, Roosevelt, who had intended to create a Bretton Woods system to uplift the living standard of the countries, of the developing countries, to end colonialism, died. He died at the wrong moment. So the Bretton Woods system never became what Roosevelt had intended. and the entire post-war system was good for Europe, it was good for the United States, but it was not good for Africa, Latin America, and Asia. And, Roosevelt was replaced by Truman, and Truman was working with Churchill, and they designed basically a system which prolonged colonialism. And that is really at the bottom of the whole problem. And that is now being challenged because, you have the BRICS Plus, that's Russia, China, India, Brazil, and South Africa. And now 19 countries of the Global South have applied for membership. And, at the next summit of the BRICS, I think 12 of them will already be discussed to become members. Others have applied for membership. And you have other organizations of the Global South, like the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the Eurasian Economic Union, the African Union, the ASEAN, the UNASUR in Latin America. All of these organizations are trying to create a new economic system, which will, if it functions, basically really create a new world economic order. So the big question in my mind is, can we convince the countries of Europe and the United States that they should not fight this new system, but they should join hands? It would be so much more in the interest of Germany, for example, rather than trying to be on the side of the so-called rules-based order, which, is trying to keep the, confrontation with Russia and China. Rather, we have to jump to a new level, a new, completely new thinking if we want to get out of this crisis. And that was the purpose of my 10 principles, because
Could I reply? I think it's not so much convincing has a role, but I think what's really the problem is the structure of the system. What the dynamic that whatever we may say, what actually happens is what's profitable. Hyman Minsky, the great economist, said Hyman Minsky, the great economist, said that if it can't be financed, it can't happen. Well, but it can happen if we make it happen. I think Julius Nyeri had wonderful things to say about the effects of colonialism. He pointed out that Swahili didn't have any word for unemployment. It didn't have any word for inflation. It didn't have any word. All of the things that we worry about and consider essential were didn't exist for hundreds of years for people who got along in different cultures with different approaches, with what we call different basic cultural structures. I think Marx was on the right track when he said that, he and Engels said that the first thing we need to know about human beings is that they exist. And for them to exist, there have to be the material organization of the means of their subsistence. Well, different cultures have done this in many different ways. It doesn't have to be done with an International Development Bank. It can be done learning from traditional cultures. I like to, as some countries in Latin America are now doing, or at least making a start toward. So I think that the conscious level is one thing, but another thing is what actually moves things so they happen. And I think that's to a great extent the legal paradigm that comes basically from Roman law, which sort of means that it's a paradigm of domination. For Roman law, the word property meant domination. And we're told today by the neoliberals that we really need only two principles to organize the world. One is property, the other is contract. And but what this boils down to is that what happens is what's profitable, not just for the USA, but for anybody, the whole, the dominant system. And I really share the idea that, well, the BRICS organization may be strong enough to challenge the USA, so at least we'll be rid of the US empire. But I'm not, well, I think we have to be a little bit skeptical. Is BRICS, how much better is BRICS going to be? If they become a real alternative, which I think might well happen, is it just going to be another economic project that's accumulating capital for a different set of people for a different set of reasons? Or is it going to be something that's really interested in meeting human needs, not just physical needs, but psychological needs, the need for dignity, the need for self-respect, the need for self-realization, the need for spiritual connection? These are often psychological, theological questions, not really economic questions. And I think we have to think in terms of a deep cultural change. I don't think anything less than that is going to save the planet and the human species.
Yes, actually, that is already embedded in the 10 principles, because when I say that we have to adjust the laws of the political, economic, and social order with the laws of the physical universe, and this was known as natural law, in European philosophy. In European philosophy, there was the idea that there is an inbuilt higher order in the creation, which is higher than man-made law. Natural law is supposed to be part of the creation of the universe. Now, that same idea you find in all cultures, in the most clearest form in the Indian idea of the cosmology, which should be a guiding force for people to act on the planet. In China, it is the mandate of heaven. I'm sure that in African philosophy, you find similar ideas that there is a higher lawfulness which you have to respect. And Schiller, the reason why the Schiller Institute is called Schiller Institute, according to the ideas of Schiller, that basically men should self-improve through aesthetical education. And that with the aesthetic education, you can not only develop your mind, but you can also educate your emotions until the point that you can blindly follow your emotions, and that they would never demand anything from you other than what reason commands. And that freedom is in necessity. Freedom is not anarchy, but when you do what is necessary for the well-being of the human species in the context of the lawfulness of the evolution of the universe, you are free. And obviously, when you try to boil down an entire philosophical outlook to 10 principles, you have to be very abstract, so to speak. But if one looks at the detail, what is actually the meaning of each expression of these 10 principles, one comes to a very rich body of philosophical foundations. So I agree with you. The absolute need is a change in the attitude, a change in the mindset. And I have found that the most controversial of the 10 principles is actually the 10th principle, where I say that the assumption is that man by nature is good. Many people say, no, man is not good, man is evil. But then if you look, for example, which philosophies say man is good by nature, you find all the great religions, Christianity, Judaism, Islam, Confucian, non-religions like Confucianism, Hinduism, Buddhism, and other forms of basic philosophies and religions, all assume that man is good by nature. And I agree with Nicolaus of Cues, who was a great thinker of the 15th century, who said that, that all evil comes from a lack of development. And once you allow the person or whatever entity to develop, you can overcome the bad things, the evil things. But if you look at empires and oligarchies like the British liberalism, they all assume man is bad by nature. You know, for example, Locke and Hobbes, they say man is evil by nature, and that's why you need a Leviathan, you need a hegemon, and that hegemon has to rule over backward people, and basically by inducing fear. You need a strong state, a Leviathan who suppresses the individual because they are all evil, and without such a ordering principle, everything would end up in chaos. I completely think that that is the characteristic of empire, because they like to portray men like that. But I think the new empire will assume that every human being is potentially a beautiful soul, because everybody can develop their own character to become a beautiful character. And every human person has the potential to become a genius. If you would educate each child from small baby age on and give it all access to universal knowledge, to study your own language in poetry, which is the highest form of expression of language, natural sciences, music, universal history, learn all other cultures, the chance that such a baby would grow up to be a creative child and eventually become a genius, is very high. And more people will develop their potential. Nowadays, people cannot do that, because if you are struggling to get your one meal a day, you have no time to learn. You're struggling to get clean water. So all this human talent is wasted. And I think that's why I put as the second principle the need to overcome poverty. The third principle, to prolong life through modern health systems. The third principle, or the fourth principle, universal education for everybody. So all of these principles are, thought out to fit together, and one is necessarily leading to the next one.
Yes, please, Janet Gerson. Janet, you are welcome.
Thank you, George. And thank you, Helga. And thank you for Richard for this extremely erudite discussion. Helga, I know many people who follow the thinking that you presented, and what an education, the concise way that you've laid it out for us. It's quite fantastic. And I'm wondering how the other people who've just listened to it what they're absorbing and reacting. I would love to hear, and I hope you too would like to hear some of the how other people comprehended and reacted to this talk. So that's my compliment, and I only have that question to expand the discussion and see what other people are thinking. So thank you. Thank you, George.
Yeah, thank you very much.
But
indeed.
Someone else has to raise their hand. So we might be intimidated, right? Because that was so erudite, and Howard's response, the two very comprehensive pictures. So what little bits might we add? Just listen to that. Thank you. Well,
actually, I was about to ask you, Janet, really about your response, and but I wanted to keep that towards the end. But maybe Afiz has a comment or question. Please, Afiz. Nice to have you again.
Thank you, sir. I really appreciate our presenter for breaking down all the principles and giving explanation on each principle. So it gives no room for everyone to go against the principles. But I actually mean the principle, the first principle and the number 8 principle. Maybe you can recall or re-say it so that I can grasp it very well. Then on the property level, I'm thinking the principle might not be able to work in hands, because if you look at our hand, the fingers we have are not equal. So even though if we are to follow the family issue or family pattern of or system of organizing the family, we must know that one person must be at the head. So in these your thinking principles, which country do you choose to be the head of executing or implementing the principles so that it can get across all the world? For instance, you made mention of organizations. You made mention of UN organization, but the UN impact has been dropping. The influence of UN to control or to stop the war in the world has been declining, because if not, they should be able to stop the war in between Ukraine and Russia. And presently, the one that is going on in Sudan. So the African Union also failed to control that. So we need to be asking ourselves, what is the function of all these organizations we have in the world if we cannot calm or stop war? Because one of the definitions of peace was absence of war. So for us to maintain and keep peace, we must try to strive to stop any form of war or conflict or crisis. So my question, to recap the question, is that I've missed number 1 and number 8 in your principle. Then the second one, which country do you choose to be the head in executing all these principles, despite the fact that all these fingers are not equal? Thank you.
You are muted, Helga. You are
Okay.
muted. Right.
Well, I mean, you are right. You know, unfortunately, the UN has not been able to stop the war, and that has naturally to do with the fact that in the UN Security Council, you have the 2 blocks represented, which I said are at a loggerhead against each other. You have the US, British, French on the one side, and then you have Russia, China on the other side. And ever since the US and NATO lied to the UN Security Council on the war against Libya in 2011, because they said that this would not be a military intervention, but then it was. And at that time, Russia and China declared themselves to be neutral, but they were lied to, because it was then a full-fledged military intervention in Libya, which killed Gaddafi. And my late husband, Lyndon LaRouche, at that point had said, you know, that this is the beginning of World War III, because he recognized that when the major forces, major countries who are in the UN Security Council are lying, they make practically the UN Security Council defunct. And that he recognized that that was the beginning of World War III. And right now you see it again, you know, in the UN, whenever the UN has a vote, for example, they wanted to have a vote asking the developing countries to condemn the Russian unprovoked aggression. And you can actually see that the large countries, India, Brazil, South Africa, they did not condemn Russia because they recognized that it was much more complicated and that there was a prehistory before this war. While many of the small countries, especially of the Commonwealth countries, they voted with either neutral or whatever. You know, and that is basically because the US and the British assert a lot of pressure on individual countries. And that way you get votes inside the United Nations which do not really reflect what these countries actually think, but, you know, it reflects the present, you know, geopolitical power constellation. I think what is required is not to look at this in a static way, but we have to organize for it. You know, the problem is we are on the verge of World War III. We are on the verge of a collapse of the neoliberal system. You could have a collapse of the financial system, which would lead to a dark age. You know, if the banking system collapses and there is no replacement there, it could lead to a catastrophe. I mean, the developing countries would be hit the worst. You know, many people would die. This is why what we are proposing is not, you know, it's not something which is already in existence, but it is something which we have to bring into being by organizing more forces. And I think the objective possibility does exist because, you know, the BRICS have a different conception about, you know, they do apply sovereignty, they do apply respect for the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence, and more countries of the global south want to join them. You can see, I mean, there is not one country where I would say this is the perfect match to the 10 principles, but there are countries which are closer to it than others, and I would definitely say that one country which is closer to the idea is China. For example, if you look at the peace making ability of China, for example, through Chinese mediation, they got together Iran and Saudi Arabia, the 2 arch enemies of the Southwest Asia for decades, you know, where the Sunni and the Shiite Muslims were always against each other. You have proxy forces in Lebanon, in Syria, in Yemen, you know, which belonged either to Iran or to Saudi Arabia. And now that basically through Chinese mediation, Iran and Saudi Arabia have matched up, and, you know, President Raisi from Iran has been invited to Saudi Arabia, and the Saudi head of state called him my brother. You know, these are big steps. So this means now there is peace possible in Yemen. Syria is now joining the Arab League. Syria is welcome to re-enter the Arab League. There are many steps, you know, and that is why I think that the Chinese mediation offer for the Ukraine crisis is actually hopeful. You know, I think that's the most promising track, together with Lula, who has said he wants to form a peace club of developing countries. Pope Francis is very important. We are also supporting his initiative. And I think all of these initiatives must be brought together. We have to internationalize the peace movement. You know, the peace movement in the United States, they had a demonstration on February 19th, which was called Rage Against the War Machine, where all parties of different color were working together, the Libertarians, the People's Party, the independent LaRouche candidate, Diane Sayre, the communists, I mean, all kinds of groupings from left to right work together. In Berlin, in end of February, you had 50,000 people demonstrating, where again, right and left were coming together, and people said, we all have to be for peace first, because if there's war, nobody will survive. So let's put all our differences behind us. We can solve issues we have about climate, environment, all of these things we can discuss later. First, we have to have peace, because if there's no peace, we all will be dead and all of these questions will be mute. So the Schiller Institute is right now engaged in trying to, you know, bring into contact people from Latin America with Europe, with Americans, and I want to invite all of you to be part of that, because I think, you know, we need an international movement of world citizens. The fact that the entire human species is threatened by extinction, all of us are in danger to die, and that makes automatically every human being on this planet a citizen of the world, because, you know, the world has become the issue of each of us. So I want to invite you to be part of that.
Thank you very much indeed. Some more questions or comments? I will ask one if I don't see a hand raised. There was this comment, and I think also Janet liked it, that, okay, development also means investment. But when we look at what Nicholas of Cusa said, that evil is lack of development, I'm sure that he didn't mean development to be investment. So what kind of development was he referring to?
Well, development in Cusa means, naturally, this was a theological discussion. In the Bible, you have this, that people get talents, and the person who buried the talents was accused. He said, you did not make use of your talents. You're not supposed to bury them and preserve them. You're supposed to develop them. And what I mean by development in the sense of Cusanus, or this whole tradition of humanist philosophy, I mean, every person, when you are born, you have a potential. And if that potential is being developed or not, makes a difference. If you, as I said before, if you don't have basic needs fulfilled, like food, healthcare, proper devices for learning and all of these things, you cannot develop. What I mean by developing is, you can learn poetry, you can learn science, you can become a teacher, you can develop everybody has different potentialities. Some things are universal, that's why you need universal principles to be educated to all people, no matter what country or civilization they come from. But then the beauty is that in the unity, there is also diversity. For example, if you look at African culture, Chinese culture, European culture, they are very different, but all of them have to contribute something, and it is that diversity which is limitless. The more people develop their potential, there will be never a second Beethoven. There will be never a second Einstein. But we don't even know what potentials exist, because only when they come out will they be visible. Eventually, when the whole human species has optimal condition, the number of people who will be extraordinarily creative will be the vast majority. And eventually, almost everybody will be a genius. Genius doesn't mean that everybody will be alike. It will, in the realm of creativity, the degrees of freedom is limitless. And I think that if you think about the last 10,000 years, or let's say go back to the Stone Age, it's a little bit longer, but it's not from the standpoint of the age of the universe. What is 10,000 years? It's nothing. It's like a nanosecond. But the human species, we have made such an incredible development. We have turned from gatherers and hunters, where the population potential of the human species was maybe 5 million people on the planet. And if we would have stayed at that level, we would have not progressed, and eventually we would have collapsed, because more people would have eaten all rabbits and eaten all berries, and then there would have been a population crisis and everything would have collapsed. But the human species is the only species which can discover new principles. So we discovered agriculture. Rather than hunting, we started to make cattle, for farms. And by farming and having agriculture and cattle for human consumption, we could become more people. So maybe not 5 million, but 50 million, then soon 100 million. Now we are at 8 billion. And if we would use all existing technologies, we would not have deserts which grow, which right now the deserts do, but we could reforest the deserts. We could, turn a lot of land which is now not usable for human beings, it could be turned into gardens. take Sudan, for example. You know, Sudan right now is torn apart by the danger of a terrible civil war. But Sudan could be the breadbasket for not only Africa, but for most of the planet, because the soil in Sudan is so fertile. All you need is to put water on it. You know, you could have 4 harvests in Sudan. Right now, the agriculture in Sudan is accidental. When the weather is moist, it rains, then the harvest is good. And many animals can grow. Then come several years of drought, everything dies, you know, or even if you have good agriculture, because the weather is good, you don't have food processing, so the food decays and you can't transport it. If you would develop the infrastructure in Sudan, you know, you could use the waters of the Blue Nile and the White Nile, and, you know, you could have water management, irrigation. Sudan could become one of the richest countries on the planet because they do have the natural resources, and, you know, that would be the basis for peace. How do you get peace? It's not the oil in South Sudan. It is the potential creativity of the Sudanese people. If every Sudan, I have been in Sudan, so I have seen how it looks. If you go out of Khartoum, at the outskirts of Khartoum, you have families who are living from 3 goats. They have nothing but 3 goats. How can you educate your children when all you have is a little plot of land and 3 goats? I mean, that's what I mean by development. If you were irrigation and you could make agriculture, you would apply modern knowledge about agriculture, fertilizer, you would study how the earth is composed. Sudan is, together with Ukraine, the most fertile soil on the earth. And the Sudanese could feed all the rest of Africa, just the one country. Doesn't mean they should only have agriculture, but I'm just saying that this is something where you can see what the potential would be. So development is really to bring out the potential of people. And as I said in one of the principles, the only source of wealth is the creativity of people. It's not raw material. It's not the control of trade. My late husband, Lyndon LaRouche, has written a lot about that. So I would invite you to go to our website and study some of his writings about physical economy. And that will be, we also have a LaRouche Legacy Foundation, which has published the LaRouche Library, where we make all the books available for everybody. We want, you know, and we have also educationals. If you want, you can join our classes on these matters. So I welcome you to do that.
Thank you very much indeed, Helga, for this wonderful presentation. I wish we could actually stay longer, but there is good news actually that she'll be answering some questions in about less than actually 30 minutes in her program. And I don't know how you can invite the people to continue the conversation here. Would you like to say how we can join you?
Yes,
this afternoon?
I would invite you to go to the website of the Schiller Institute, schillerinstitute.com. We have many programs there. I have a webcast in English. Actually, after this one, at 5 o'clock it will start. Every Wednesday I try to be in time. Then we have many other programs on the LaRouche organization. I will send you the links, and then you can share them with all your members of your organization.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining us. Actually, this is the Global Peace Studies for Sustainable Development in Africa, and the theme today was the need for a new paradigm, and I'm sure that we'll continue the conversation. I particularly also thank Howard Richards for his also wonderful comments, and of course, Janet and everybody else. Please, let's join again next week. We have Professor Egon Spiegel taking us through the facets of peace. So you are welcome. And it's Global Peace Studies. Today we have more speakers than participants, with the number of women being equal to that of men. This is quite wonderful. Thank you very much indeed. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Have a wonderful day.